started with a glance, just a glance. But it wasn't any ordinary glance. There was something in her eyes that caught me off guard. A vulnerability, perhaps a kind of quiet longing that I couldn't quite understand. I had seen her in church countless times before, sitting with her husband, always the picture of grace, always the perfect wife and mother. She was devoted, a pillar of the community, someone every man in the congregation respected. But this time, it was different. This time, something flickered behind her eyes, something that reached out to me in a way I couldn't ignore. At first, I told myself it was nothing. I was her pastor, and she was a member of my congregation. The line between us should have been clear, well-defined. But there it was, this unexpected spark that shouldn't have existed. I pushed it aside. I prayed. I reminded myself of my calling, of my vows, of the life I had built with my own wife. But even as I did, the feeling lingered, uninvited and unrelenting. I had seen that look in her eyes before, though never aimed at me. It was a quiet kind of plea, as if she were searching for something more than the life she had. She wasn't unhappy, at least not on the surface. She was always so put together, so composed. Her family was the ideal Christian family, but there was something about her smile, something about the way she listened so intently when I spoke, that told me she wasn't quite as whole as she appeared. I began to notice little things, the way she avoided my gaze, the subtle shifts in her posture whenever I was near. She would glance at me only to look away quickly, as if caught in a moment of vulnerability that frightened her. I, too, would catch myself looking at Heronly to quickly turn my gaze elsewhere. It was a silent battle, one that neither of us dared to acknowledge, but one that we both felt. Her mood, too, seemed to have an effect on me. I would sense a shift in the atmosphere when she walked into the room. There were times when her presence made it difficult to focus on my sermon, and I would find myself stumbling over words. My hands would shake slightly when I saw her smile from across the room, her eyes seemingly calling out to me in a way no words could. I wasn't blind to the reality of my situation. She was a married woman, and I was her pastor. There was a line I couldn't cross, and I knew it. But that didn't make the attraction any less real. It gnawed at me, pulling at something deep within, something I didn't know how to control. And with each passing day, I found myself more and more unable to escape the pull. I tried to convince myself that it was just a fleeting thought, just a passing feeling. I told myself that I had no right to feel this way. But the truth was, it was becoming harder to ignore. Every Sunday, every glance, every word we exchanged seemed to only make things worse. She seemed to sense it too. There were moments when I would catch her looking at me for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, only for her to quickly turn her head, pretending nothing was amiss. She was just as careful as I was, always trying to hide what neither of us could fully understand. Yet, despite the avoidance, despite the attempts to push the feeling down, I couldn't shake the idea that she, too, felt it, the magnetic pull that seemed to draw us closer, even as we tried so hard to stay apart. I wondered sometimes if it was just me, if I was reading too much into it, if I was allowing my mind to play tricks on me. But there were moments, fleeting as they were, when I would look up and see her gaze lingering on me, and I would feel something stir inside me, something I couldn't explain. I didn't know what she saw in me, or if she saw anything at all, but I couldn't deny the effect she had on me. Her presence seemed to awaken something in me, something I had long buried beneath my role as a pastor, a husband, and a father. It was like a fire small at first, barely noticeable but soon growing, threatening to consume everything in its path. It wasn't just the attraction, though. It was the way she seemed to need me, not in any overt way, but in the subtle shifts in her behavior, in the way she sought me out during fellowship, or lingered after services, always just a little too long. It was the way her mood would change depending on my words, the way she seemed to hang on to every sermon, as if they were meant for her, as if they spoke to some hidden part of her soul that she couldn't reach on her own. I wanted to help her, to ease whatever burden she carried, but I didn't know what it was. What could I protect her from? What was it that drew me to her in such an inexplicable way? Was it my role as her pastor, my duty to guide her, or was it something else? I didn't have the answers, and the more I tried to make sense of it, the more complicated things became. It wasn't until she mentioned it, casually, almost in passing, that I began to see the full scope of the situation. She was being transferred, an international project. It was a relief for her, she said, a new beginning. I saw a glimmer of hope in her eyes, something that looked almost like freedom. She was ready to leave, to start over, to escape whatever was weighing her down. I thought it would be a good thing, a way for both of us to move on and put these feelings behind us. But the transfer never came. And with that, something changed. The tension between us began to build. Every word we spoke to each other, every accidental brush of hands, seemed to ignite the spark further. The walls we had both carefully constructed to protect ourselves from the undeniable pull between us were starting to crumble. We couldn't fight it anymore. The unspoken attraction was becoming too much to bear, and as much as we both tried to resist it, we both knew that something was about to break. The weeks that followed felt like an unbearable tightrope walk. Every Sunday, I would find myself glancing in her direction, pretending to focus on my sermon, all the while knowing she was there, watching, listening. And the worst part was the way she seemed to be doing the same. I would catch her looking at me, just a quick glance, a fleeting moment before she quickly turned her eyes away, pretending as though nothing had happened. But I knew. I could feel it in the air, thick with unspoken words. There was a strange energy between us, one that couldn't be ignored. Her eyes would linger on me just a little too long, and then she would smile, but it wasn't the kind of smile that said everything was fine. It was the kind of smile that hinted at something deeper, something more meaningful, a secret smile that said, we both understood what was happening, even if neither of us could admit it aloud. I tried to focus on my family. I would come home after service, hold my wife and children close, thankful for their presence, for the love and stability they brought into my life. But even as I held them, my mind would wander. It was like a constant undercurrent, an itch I couldn't scratch. And no matter how hard I tried to shake it off, my thoughts would inevitably drift back to her. What made it worse was the way her presence affected me. I could feel her vulnerability even when she was surrounded by others, as if she were calling out for someone to notice. I didn't know what it was, whether it was the strain in her voice when she spoke, the way she looked so tired some days, or the weight in her eyes that hinted at something more than just the routine of daily life. But it was there, and it was impossible to ignore. I wanted to protect her, though I didn't know what from. I wasn't even sure I was capable of protecting her from anything at all. There were moments when I could sense her longing for something more. She had mentioned her desire to leave about the transfer, the new international project. It seemed like an escape for her, a chance to break free from whatever burden she was carrying. She was so excited, so hopeful. And yet, when the news didn't come, when she learned that the transfer had been delayed indefinitely, the light in her eyes dimmed. I saw the change in her. It wasn't drastic, but it was there. Her usual smiles faded, replaced with a quiet kind of resignation. She began to withdraw further, isolating herself from the fellowship she once embraced. I didn't know if she was disappointed because the transfer didn't happen, or if it was because she felt trapped in a life that didn't bring her fulfillment. I wanted to ask, to reach out, but I held back. I didn't know how to approach her without crossing a line that I feared would be too difficult to undo. I couldn't stop myself from thinking about her. Every time I saw her sitting in the congregation, my heart would race. I could feel my pulse quicken as if just being in her presence made everything else fade into the background. The congregation around me would blur, and it would feel like it was just the two of us in the room. It was a feeling that terrified me and exhilarated me at the same time. It was during one of those moments, one of those quiet, charged silence, that I realized I was in deeper than I thought. I had been so careful, so diligent in keeping my distance, yet the pull was undeniable. She was not just another member. She was not just another face in the crowd. There was something about her, something that spoke to a part of me that I had buried long ago. It was during a particularly tense service that it happened. We had exchanged a few polite words after the sermon, just as we always did. But this time something was different. I saw it in her eyes, the way they softened, the way her lips parted slightly as if to say something, but she held herself back. It was then that I realized just how much I had been avoiding. There was something there, something we were both too afraid to confront. I could feel the weight of it pressing down on us. And yet, we both played our parts. I continued to preach, to guide my flock, and she continued to show up, to be the devoted wife and mother. On the outside, nothing had changed, but inside, we were both drowning in something we could not define. There was an attraction, yes, but there was something else too, a need to be seen, to be understood. It was the kind of need that could not be satisfied by polite words or fleeting moments of connection. It was deeper than that, and it was pulling us both in. I couldn't keep pretending that it was nothing. Every word I preached, every prayer I uttered felt like a lie. How could I guide others toward righteousness when I couldn't even keep my own heart in check? How could I stand before God and my congregation, knowing what was happening between us? It felt like a betrayal, yet I couldn't stop it. I couldn't stop looking at her, couldn't stop wondering if she felt the same way. It was becoming unbearable. Every Sunday, every passing moment, the tension between us grew. I could feel it in the air, heavy and thick, like a storm waiting to break. She was leaving, or so I thought, and the thought of her leaving should have been a relief. It should have been the end of this unbearable attraction. But instead, it only made it worse. Because now the chance of her leaving felt like my last hope, a hope that she would be out of my life, that I could finally put this behind me. But when the transfer didn't come, I realized I was facing something much bigger than I had ever anticipated. I wasn't sure what to do, but I knew I couldn't keep pretending that nothing was happening. I couldn't keep pretending that she wasn't having the same effect on me that I was having on her. We had always kept our conversations brief and formal, exchanging pleasantries after church, nothing more. But there were moments that couldn't be ignored, when our words felt heavier, charged with something unspoken. The way she lingered a little longer than necessary. The way her gaze would soften as she spoke to me, as though there was something more she wanted to say, but couldn't find the words. I found myself craving those moments, even though I knew they were dangerous. I started noticing the small things, the way her lips quivered slightly when she smiled, the faint tremble in her voice when she spoke. She nodded, her eyes distant. I have been offered an opportunity, an international project. It is a chance to escape, to start fresh. I've been thinking about it for a while now, but I am not sure. I didn't know what to say. Part of me felt relieved at the thought of her leaving, of putting this dangerous attraction behind us. But another part of me, the part I couldn't quite control, felt disappointed. The idea of her leaving felt like a door closing, and I wasn't sure I wanted it to close. Not yet. "Are you sure it's what you want?" I asked, almost without thinking. She hesitated. "I'm not sure of anything anymore, but it feels like the right choice, like a way out." I wanted to say something, to offer comfort, but the words didn't come. Instead, I stood there, silently watching her, wondering what had brought her to this point. What had driven her to feel so disconnected from her life, from everything she had once known? I wanted to know more, but I couldn't ask. Not yet. "I have been struggling," she said, almost to herself, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know who I am anymore. I I don't feel like I belong here. Not in the church, not in my marriage. I feel like I am losing myself. Her words hit me harder than I expected. I could feel the weight of her pain, the rawness of her emotions. It wasn't just about the church or the marriage. It was something deeper, something that had been building for a long time. The story is just about to get interesting. Please give us a follow and thumbs up to encourage us in bringing more relatable life stories to you. The story continues in our next video.